This is arising from a counselling session yesterday, and this is around boundaries and putting up boundaries, and the fact that when people have had their boundaries abused, sometimes they can feel guilty about taking action to stop that. Now, the action might be separating yourself from the person, perhaps in a relationship, or perhaps it's a housemate or something else, or it might be just an action of finally saying no if it's in a relationship that you want to maintain. Finally saying no and sort of pushing back a bit and saying that boundaries have got to change. These things have got to change. But people who have their boundaries taken advantage of will often feel guilty in that moment because they feel like, well, I've colluded with this bad behaviour. And so in a sense, it's a weird thing taking all this responsibility, but it's like, so I've set it up for them to think that this is okay. I've done something to them in this sense. That's not helpful. That's taking that attitude, I guess, is partly what sort of sets you up actually for being used and abused. But it's also not helpful. And here's a way of thinking about that. So I think what we tend to instinctively do is have a kind of reciprocal way of being where we give people leeway, and that typically works. It actually makes things work well, because often somebody might be push boundaries in a certain way, and maybe that involves sort of them being a bit cranky or being too dependent on us, wanting too much of our time or whatever it is. And it might be that you sort of get frustrated by that, but you sort of don't act on it, and then it changes. They go back to behaving well, and you discover that their parent was dying. And then you think, thank goodness I didn't sort of push back or get cranky when, express my anger when I felt it. And so I think we actually, at an unconscious level, we just sort of operate with this. We operate with a certain level of healthy boundaries, but we kind of give people leeway, and that often works because all of us get pushed at times and our behaviour isn't what it would normally be. So this works well. And so I think we're kind of set up to do this in some way. I won't go into, I'm not even thinking through the details of this myself, but I think as a pattern this happens, and it actually just makes things function well and makes us kind of kind to one another and give leeway to one another. Now the problem is, what about people who don't have normal healthy boundaries? So the bad behaviour that they're sort of engaging in, you give them leeway and they don't change, they don't come back to healthy behaviour, they just take advantage. You give them an inch and they take a mile and they run with it. And 6 months later, 2 years later, you're in a bad pattern with this person, and you're now having to sort of try and stop that, put up boundaries, or distance yourself from the person. And now, as I say, you're feeling bad, as if you've let them feel like it's okay to behave like this, and then you've kind of disciplined or withdrawn from them. Well, I think that's just a total mistake. Because what you've been doing originally was doing what we do with everybody. You couldn't, let's say you couldn't foresee that they were going to break boundaries, that they were going to keep up this behaviour. Well, you were doing what it was automatically natural to do, and then they didn't change. And so it's something you had to realise over time. It just doesn't make sense to take responsibility for that. It can be helpful as a learning process to say, what could have I done differently in future? But I think often you're not going to know in advance, and so you're only going to know at the point where it's becoming too much, and then you're going through a process where you eventually push back or distance or whatever. So don't add fuel to the fire of your own sort of guilt and your own struggle in that moment by blaming yourself for their abuse of boundaries. It was part of our natural behavioural unconscious reciprocal sort of pattern to give them leeway, like you give everybody leeway. The trouble is, what's going to emerge is that then some people are going to take advantage of that, and you're not going to see it at first until it's too late, until you then have to do something about it.